Hi, my name is Alina Rocha Menocal, and I'm the director of the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice. Thanks so much for tuning in. For the June-July edition of the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice newsletter, I have the pleasure to speak with Ashley Jackson. And Ashley is co-director and co-founder of the Center on Armed Groups. The Center on Armed Groups supports efforts to reduce violence and end armed conflict through innovative research by creating safe spaces for dialogue and providing practical advice. Ashley herself is a world-leading expert on armed groups, conflict, and peace building, and she has undertaken groundbreaking research on the dynamics between civilian populations and armed groups, including in particular the Taliban in Afghanistan. She has also advised numerous international organizations, including UN agencies, NGOs, and governments on humanitarian access, conflict mediation, and stabilization. Ashley, welcome. I'm so delighted that you can join us today, and I'm very excited to hear more about your research and the kind of influence it has had in the policy world. So maybe perhaps we can start by hearing a little bit more from you about your research on the Taliban and other armed groups and the kinds of questions that have driven your research.
Sure. And thanks for asking me to chat. I always like talking to you whenever we have a chance to catch up. Um, so my work really comes out of practical dilemmas. I mean, I started my career as an aid worker, and later working for political affairs at the UN, and finding myself in Afghanistan in 2009, 10, 11, which for those of us that remember that period, it was the height of this military surge, this effort to push back the Taliban. But what I was seeing on the ground was very different from what the policy documents, what the public narrative said. And I was both frustrated and really interested in why there was that discrepancy and how the Taliban could possibly be winning. I was living in Eastern Afghanistan at this point, working for the UN. And despite this enormous influx of American troops there and this enormous influx of resources, it really did look as though it was having this kind of counterproductive effect, that there were all these perverse effects. You know, you had this governor who was this warlord. I don't really like that term, but that very accurately describes the kind of caricature of who he was. He was involved in all sorts of nefarious activities, corrupt, hated by a lot of Afghans living in that area of the country. And the people the international community was backing, were pretty horrible, right? And so you kind of, when you see this on the ground, then you begin to understand how the Taliban makes inroads, and why this strategy of stabilization and democracy and human rights and all these things that should be what people want, that should work, that should stabilize, was actually having an opposite effect. And so I left and I joined ODI as a research fellow, where I met you, Alina, many years ago. And I led this program it was called Talking to the Other Side. And it was all about interviewing armed groups about humanitarian access and about aid agencies. So I started with the Taliban. I did work on Al-Shabaab. I worked with some amazing scholars with excellent connections in South Sudan and in Darfur and in Syria, doing the same thing, really talking to armed groups, because what was missing was kind of the perspective of populations living under armed group control, of the armed groups themselves, of really understanding them. There was a lot of talking about them and about what they were supposed to represent, but really that on the ground kind of immersive research was where I found myself. And that eventually, many moons later, led to the founding of the Center on Armed Groups. And we really try to look at these issues and bring the kind of deep fieldwork, deep research, evidence, analysis, different perspectives from the other side of the conflict, which gets talked about, but not often really looked at in that way. And we try and translate those findings into really practical advice. You know, what would I have done differently as a political affairs officer, or rather, what should the head of the UN in Afghanistan been doing differently? What should have, the Americans been doing differently during that time? And really try and advise people. And we work across a wide spectrum of countries. We still work in Afghanistan with the Taliban, who are now, of course, the kind of de facto authorities, or the government, depending on how you might refer to them. We work in Myanmar, Somalia, many, many countries. And that's kind of what led me to this, was that kind of misunderstanding and the bad policy that resulted in places like Afghanistan.
Thank you so much, Ashley. That's actually quite comprehensive, and there are a few things that I would like to follow up on with you. But firstly, this idea of talking to the other side and actually speaking to either the armed groups themselves or the populations that live under their control. I imagine that as a researcher, it's not immediately obvious that you can get access and especially gain the trust of people who are meant to be your sources of information and interlocutors. So how did you go about opening those kinds of doors for you to be able to engage with them and ask what must be very politically sensitive questions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are a couple of things I would say. And what we try to do at the center is we always have mixed teams, right? And we really put an emphasis on trying to get researchers from the context to lead and propose research ideas. And then we go and get funding for their brilliant ideas, because the best ideas come from people who are immersed in the context, right? And a lot of what I do as a foreign researcher, as an outsider, is listen to what people tell me, and try and repackage that as my idea. I mean, honestly, that's my job as a researcher, to translate that. But some of us do it better than others, really listening to kind of people telling us, you're asking the wrong questions. And I think if you're a good researcher, often whatever questions you begin with very rapidly change once you start talking to people, because it turns out you had all these assumptions which are totally irrelevant or not the most interesting thing you could be looking at. So one thing is to really throw money behind and support behind the people who are actually there, working in mixed teams. But for me as an outsider, I think I really depend on people, and I depended on trust. I still do this in our work in Somalia. It's about spending a lot of time developing relationships. I spent, 20 times more time sitting with people and having coffee and trying to figure out, how to get to the person I need to get to and how to get the right introduction so they'll open up, and where to have the meeting, as I do actually doing the work, right? A lot of this is about that trust and building networks. And you can't do that artificially, right? It has to be a genuine relationship of trust with people where they understand that you're willing to take a risk, you're willing to listen, they understand what your motivations are as well. So I think that's part of it. As an outsider, you can never really, there are things I will never ever get, right? But spending time and being willing to sort of question my own assumptions and completely throw my research out the window if it it's reflecting what the reality on the ground actually is.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating point about you may have your research questions ahead of time, but I guess when you're engaging with your with the people that you're speaking with on the ground, this may change completely. And I suspect there's also a language issue and about how certain concepts translate or don't with the people that you're speaking with. So that sounds really interesting. Let me ask you a little bit about the content and the substance of your research, because I know from speaking with you and from hearing you also in different panels and reading your research that a lot of it runs counter a lot of the assumptions that are made about how things should be. Which is, of course, why we have to work on all of these issues from a thinking, working politically perspective. And I was wondering if you can share with us what have been some of the biggest from the biggest findings that you have from your research and the work that you've been doing with the Center on Armed Groups that challenge conventional wisdom about conflict, peace building, stabilization.
Oh, there are a lot. But I think part of it is trying to understand the civilian perspective, actually. Whilst I might run the Center on Armed Groups, actually the most interesting thing to me is about people who engage with armed groups, who live under their control, who live in that gray area between one side of the conflict and another. And one of, I think, the most important things that we get wrong is that there's a civilian, like an impartial civilian, whose support we can secure through stabilization, or who's going to be bought into a democracy or whatever it might be. Actually, there is no middle ground. There is no neutrality. Both, any set of belligerents in a conflict is trying to eliminate neutrality as an option for civilians, right? They're trying to take them over to their side. There's a lot of kind of quotes from Mao and whatever about people being the ocean, and I don't know if the gorillas or the fish, I can't remember what they are, but it's all about winning the civilian population. There is no prize. The territory is not the prize. The people are the prize. And whilst the Taliban, al-Shabaab might not be classic communist guerrilla liberation movements, it's the same theory, right? And in a lot of these contexts, it's the people, it's influencing the space. And that leaves civilians not a lot of options. So this idea that we can win their support, not really about that, because they don't have a lot of choice in terms of who they support. They're trying to sort of survive. They have very short time horizons. They have very imperfect information, and they're hedging their bets. And a lot of what they're doing is about navigating an uncertain situation rather than throwing any kind of support behind a great idealistic cause. They're trying to survive, right? And nobody looks like a good guy in this situation. I mean, going back to my experience in Afghanistan, it wasn't that people necessarily loved the Taliban or loved the government. They just were exhausted. They were disillusioned by both sides. There weren't particularly good guys on either side. And so what do you do in that situation? You get what you can for your family, your village, your community, and you try and survive as best as you can. And I think that's something that often gets lost when we talk about stabilization, when we talk about all of the choices people make and the assumptions we have about them.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for that. I mean, some of the things that I have seen out there talk about armed groups like the Taliban, Al-Shabaab, etc., including from your own work, cohabitating in a way that may not necessarily give them legitimacy, but certainly acceptance. Can you talk a little bit about that perspective in terms of how populations engage with armed groups and how armed groups try to build their own relationships with them?
Yeah, I mean, we often conceive of armed groups as this other, this kind of like untouchable other. And sometimes they are, but usually it's someone in your family who's joined the Taliban or has joined the resistance in Myanmar, or there's a link, right? There's an embeddedness to these groups, even when they come from outside. We've just done some work on Islamic State in Afghanistan, and they're very much now embedded in communities. And so it's this network of relationships and of kinship, and you can't avoid it. And I think in these sort of internal armed conflicts, what happens is also that those connections are quite useful. There's kind of this idea that in Somalia and Afghanistan, if you have a family big enough, you'll have one son in the armed forces and one son with a non-state armed group, right? With the Taliban or Al-Shabaab, right? Because you're hedging your bets. And that's probably a caricature, and it's probably not necessarily intentional that you can kind of send one son to one side and one to the other, but it's helpful. It's helpful to have a diverse network, because you never know how it's going to turn out. And you never know when a relative is going to be kidnapped, when an armed group is going to ask for taxes that you don't want to pay and you want someone to help negotiate with you. You never know. So I think what a lot of people do, as any of us do with our networks, right, is to sort of build these connections and keep lines of communication open. I remember in Afghanistan, I went to this place called Baghlan, and a journalist who's a friend of mine took me up there, and his brother was the police chief, right? But his uncle was a Taliban commander. And so we had this surreal situation where I had this sort of picnic with these families. And my journalist friend was like, this is the best way to, interview everyone. But it was like, there was a police chief and there was a Taliban. I mean, both sides were there. And so I think, it's not always the case, but I think in a lot of these contexts we work in, at least, there are these overlapping circles of influence. And even the police, even the Taliban, need to have the phone numbers of the other side, because you just don't know when you'll need them.
Yeah, so the divides are not as clear in a way from what you're saying there.
Not at all.
So tell me, I mean, you have said that a big ambition of this work is to influence policymakers, how they think about this, how they conceptualize the challenges, and how we can challenge assumptions about how things work on the ground. Tell me a little bit about the kind of influence that you have seen, that you have had through your research and through the center itself.
Yeah, I think for us, okay, it's a state-based international system, and we're not trying to legitimize armed groups. We're not trying to sort of change this international framework in any real way. But it has gotten harder since 9/11 actually to talk to non-state armed groups, to engage with them, to engage because they're common interests, right? There are issues and global challenges like climate change. There are issues where there's common ground, often like cultural heritage. We just don't talk to them, you know? And I think even in peace building programs, there's a UN review that's either out or just about to come out. And, you know, the UN Peace Building Fund, a lot of those projects, they have nothing to do with areas controlled by armed groups or armed groups themselves, right? So it's this other thing that's externalized, and we're missing a huge piece of the puzzle when we talk about conflict resolution, but also when we talk about all of these other global challenges and things we care about, even if they are kind of seen as secondary. I've just sort of said climate change and cultural preservation because actually we find those are really interesting entry points to talk to armed groups and de facto authorities. They want legitimacy, they want a seat at the table. They can't have a seat at the big state-based international community table, but they can have a seat at these other tables. We can have other kinds of conversations with them. And that allows us to better understand them. And much like civilians on the ground, it helps to have these phone numbers for when the time comes or when something comes up, right? Building these secondary relationships doesn't always legitimize them. It doesn't always kind of deal with the big ticket items, like ending the conflict. But in such a sort of fragmented international order where we see peace building structures breaking down, where we see chronic kind of ongoing conflicts that just shapeshift, it is so important to begin to build these connections. And so that's part of our work that I find most interesting and meaningful. We've been around for a year and a half, so we're not that old, but what we're learning is that there are a lot of ways to talk to the other side, right? And there are a lot of things we can talk about. And there are a lot of political spaces, if you think about kind of thinking and working politically, where you can get into a less political space, and that brings you closer to the real politics of things. It creates a foundation to shape the bigger arena politics, if that makes sense. We're still kind of a little mosquito on the margins, but I do think that that's the easier way in, right? We're not gonna change the system as such, but something has to change. I think the last 20 years have shown us that this sort of paradigm of counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, stabilization, there's a missing piece, and we have to begin to rethink some of the assumptions, not throw it all out, right? There are useful things in that framework as well, but to begin to modify for the sort of fragmentation and the things that don't work for us anymore.
Yeah. How receptive do you feel that these bilateral and multilateral organizations that you work with have been to the, challenging messages that come across from your work?
Yeah, I think a lot of my research and a lot of the panels we've been on together, I kind of come in and saying, "Oh, it's completely not what you think it is. You've got it all wrong," and I've like tried to be very provocative. But we wouldn't survive as an organization if that's what we did. Just tell people they're wrong all the time. But I think what we try to do is look at their problem set, right, and say, okay, in this country, you have these objectives, and you want to talk to this armed group, or you want to deliver humanitarian aid in this area. We try to find a solution, right? And often that comes from research and analysis, and anything that flows from that, setting up a platform for dialogue, looking at policies, finding a framework. But I think, yeah, just looking at the problem and kind of with an open mind, like how can we tackle, we do a lot of work in Afghanistan still, right? And the question is, we can't talk to the Taliban, we can't recognize them for Western states, right? And they don't want to talk to us about like the top tier priorities. So what else do we talk to them about? What else do we need to understand? And then you begin to work on these second, third, fourth order priorities that don't confer recognition, but allow you a more principled form of engagement. They allow you to have women in the room. They allow you to really kind of begin to work on these first order priorities in a kind of roundabout way. One of my Afghan friends talks about his work as being like a game of football. And I am not a sports person at all, so I don't know what that means. But what he has explained that means is that you never go straight for the goal. You always go in a zigzag fashion. You're always passing to another player. You're always trying to get there in an indirect way. And I think, yeah, that is helpful because it's also less scary to donors. It's less scary to states. It's a way around. And then you begin to build the space slowly.
Yeah, so finding politically smart ways of approaching what are very sensitive topics. Perhaps for closing, Ashley, I can ask you a little bit. You've talked about the Center on Armed Groups and the kind of work that you do and the research and the countries that you're engaged in, or the settings you're engaged in. What's on store for the center? What kinds of ideas you want to develop in the future?
I think part of what we're looking, we just had come from this team meeting, and we've been talking about these sort of alternative pathways to dialogue, because what we found inadvertently is that you need alternative pathways to engagement. I mean, again, we're a small player. We need to find the kind of margins to occupy. But I also think when we look at the sort of breakdown of the global order, but also the attention suck, Ukraine, Gaza consumes all of the attention, right? All of the resources. So you need to do more with less, and you need to be more creative. And so I think that's part of what we're beginning to sort of document some of our work with the British Council and other partners, looking at cultural heritage as an entry point to dialogue, finding other things to look at. We have a big project in Ukraine, kind of mapping different technologies and information flows. So part of what I think we need to do is look for what else it could be and begin to really experiment in terms of dialogue and in terms of engagement, and look for where there's really robust evidence to say, like, this works, this works with these types of groups. This, as a donor or as a diplomat, this is your toolkit. This is what you can kind of, when everything else isn't working, what do you invest in? When you kind of are stuck on a certain issue, you feel that you don't have an entry point to an armed group because it's prescribed, or it's a quote unquote terrorist, or it's the Houthis and they won't come talk to you, whatever it is. What is the menu of options of how you get insight, or how you kind of find an entry point for what you want to talk about? And so I think part of our work ahead is really systematizing that and building an evidence base for that. When it comes to dialogue and work in these places, a lot exists in silos, a lot exists in privately commissioned research or endeavors. And part of what we need to do as the center is really make that more public and make that more accessible. Another goal is really we work with a lot of European donors, which is amazing, and I'm so grateful for all of their support. But also, I mean, I'm based in Kenya, and I really love to work with governments in the region who have a huge role when it comes to peacemaking engagement. We have a lot to learn in terms of how they do it. And they're the ones, right, as the EU, as the US kind of withdraws or becomes more risk averse, they're the ones who will have to be doing this. So yeah.
Thank you. That's lots of food for thought.
Yeah.
I wonder if for the last question I can ask you, what has been one of the most satisfying professional experiences that you've had in your career?
Oh, wow. There have been a lot of good ones. There have been a lot of dodgy ones as well, but I think actually starting.
You can also share the dodgy one if you want.
I'll keep that off the record. But I think actually, well, it's probably two. One was probably my first job, which is as a Red Cross delegate. And that was amazing because I had this sort of complete ignorance to feel bliss in terms of how many mistakes I was making and how much I was learning, right? When you're first starting out, you have this incredible enthusiasm. But I'm also reminded of that experience when we've been starting the center. It's really hard. We don't actually know what we're doing. We're trying to do things differently. I should say we do know what we're doing to some degree, enough to be responsible, to be trusted with donor funds. But it's uncharted territory to build something new and to really confront some of the institutional and real life problems of the organizations you've worked at, and you've sort of griped, and then you're in charge, you're the boss, right? So you have to kind of deal with donor demands, you have to kind of deal with compliance and all these things, but you still want to work differently. You want to work in a way that elevates, local researchers, and you build systems to get cash and find insurance and do all the things you want to do with researchers in Darfur or in other places. And so to be able to solve some of those problems, not all of them, but to be able to build things differently has been a lot of fun.
That's fantastic, Ashley. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your insights with us. And
Thank you for asking me.
yeah, best of luck going forward. Thank you.